Thank you, Matt. In the interest of time, we are dispensing with introduction biography since you have description in your packet. So I'm just going to jump right in and talk to you first of all about slavery. This shows you the different kinds of slavery. Maryland, as all the British colonies, allowed slavery from the beginning. Maryland officially recognized enslavement in 1664, but there were already many free blacks in the colony as well as slaves at that time. Now, unlike its northern neighbors, Maryland continued as a slave state after the Revolution. The Mason-Dixon line forms the northern boundary of Maryland and also separates the slave from the free states. At the time of the Revolution, the free blacks in Maryland lost the right to vote, which they had before the Revolution during colonial times, or hold office, but they could still own land. Enslaved people, of course, had no rights. Originally, slaves were people captured in wars, and over time, it became a hereditary condition. In different parts of the world, depending on the culture, slaves were distinguished by religion, caste, ethnicity, race, and skin color. Slavery robs the enslaved person of a sense of dignity as well as their personal freedom, but it also affects the slave owner in a general degradation of morality. This shows the slavery in Montgomery County, how you can see how it proceeded from 1790 to the beginning of the Civil War. And that great increase in free blacks are due to the Quakers freeing their slaves. They did in this county own quite a few. And African Americans were, in 1860, 1/4 of the total population, but only 1/3 of the African Americans were free. This is in contrast to Maryland, where African Americans made up 1/3 of the state's population. Baltimore had more free blacks than any other city in the country just before the Civil War, and Maryland had the largest free black population. Now let's look at the slave owners. We have only 7% of the whites in Montgomery County owned slaves. Most of them then owned 15 or fewer, either a person, a couple, or a family. This was the same pattern that was true from the 1790s, or from the beginning of the county in 1776, actually. Because of the small number of slaves owned and the close proximity, enslaved people in the county were usually treated better than on large plantations that you see in the Deep South. But the largest slave owner was Allen Bowie Davis. Greenwood was his plantation just north of Brookville. And during the Civil War, he was a staunch Union man and a delegate to the Maryland General Assembly. Now, most whites in Montgomery County, as in the nation at the time, believed the African race was inferior to the white race. And this allowed the slave owners to assume the myth of slavery as a benevolent patriarchy, as you see defined here. This myth was to be erode over time as we get closer to the Civil War and into the Civil War. Now, I said that, here's an example of some of the slave housing. And actually, they vary greatly, not just in the type of housing, but in their comfort. Some of these houses were very small. Some had dirt floors instead of wood floors. Some of them didn't even have fireplaces. And you never knew if the roof was leaky or if it was situated in a place that had poor drainage, so you had water coming in onto your floor whenever it rained, that type of thing. Now, as I said, you had different types of slavery. You had different kinds of work that the slave did while on the plantation or in the family, as most of it was a small farm. They were enslaved for life, and most of them were farm laborers, since was very agricultural. They were kept healthy for procreation, and so again, they were usually treated well and fed well. But there was a great difference depending on the master. Masters would keep control of the enslaved people through manipulation of privileges and also through both psychological and physical punishment. We did have punishment, even though, as I said, they were usually treated better than in the Deep South. And punishment, as I said, takes many forms, as you see here. And though it was considered in this area a last resort, slaves were sometimes sold at an auction, as you see in this picture. And the auctions continued in the county up through the 1850s. So an enslaved person had the only way to achieve freedom was through manumission or escape. Now, we saw that the Quakers actually freed their slaves, and they did this for religious reasons, but other religions, for the most part, at that time, quoted the Bible as endorsing slavery. So they were not, the religion itself was not against enslavement. There was a movement for colonization, and even though the state of Maryland purchased some land in Liberia, no blacks from Montgomery County were ever enticed to move there. Some owners actually freed their slaves in their will, but this was not always honored by the courts if that person died with a debt. Sometimes, even though they said they freed their slaves, the slaves were then sold. And then, of course, some slaves took the matters into their own hands, and Enoch George Howard on the left made money on the side, even while he was enslaved, by selling vegetables from his garden plot. And then he purchased his own freedom from Sarah Griffith in 1851. He purchased his wife from Samuel Gaither in 1853. She purchased their 4 children in 1860, and that same year, Enoch George Howard purchased the farm on which she had been enslaved from the Gaither family. So it was possible to actually purchase yourself. Josiah Henson, who you will hear about a lot more about if you go to the first section after this one, purchased his freedom from Isaac Riley for services rendered. And if you want to find out what those services were, you can attend that next session. And that was in 1829. Now, in 1858, Josiah Henson came back and purchased his brother from Margaret Bell of the Bell Dawson House. And he did this with money that he had earned from his second autobiography. Of course, the other way of achieving freedom was through the Underground Railroad. Now, people have been escaping from enslavement ever since there was slavery, of course. In the early 1800s, there was an organized system that started up of people that would help the freedom seekers. After the railroads were built in the 1830s, this system got the name the Underground Railroad. There were many brave people involved, both black and white, men and women, rich and poor, young and old, of all different religions. They had complete trust in each other, and that trust was never compromised. There was never a person involved in the system who ever told on another person. The way it worked was as a relay system. Now, in the north, in New York and Ohio, you sometimes had hiding places, but in this area, and most of in the slave states, it was very dangerous to hide people on your own property because there were so many people around who were looking for you, looking out for abolitionists, looking out for freedom seekers. So you would feed them and then give them directions on how to get to the next person. They would usually sleep in the fields or the swamps and the forests at night. So that was the system that worked in this area. There were a number of people who actually did escape from Montgomery County. Some Quakers in Sandy Spring actually aided the fugitives, and as I say, as part of this relay system. Abolitionists from the north came down and helped others, as I'll talk about in just a moment. And they usually were in the District of Columbia, but worked in Montgomery County as well. Historical and oral history accounts list the following escapes in the 1830s and 40s from Montgomery County. And this is not a complete list, but just will give you an idea. The brothers Thomas and William Holland escaped from the Hollings River area. Annie and Abraham Young, with 2 small children and a niece, Mary Jane Weems, escaped from Adam Robb's estate in Rockville. John escaped from Elisha Williams in 1832. Mary Jones and Susan Bell from Rockville, they were part of the estate as well, of the Adam Robb's estate. Ben and Warren escaped from Charles Brown near Sandy Spring in 1857. And one of the more famous escapes was Anne Marie Weems, who escaped from Charles Price, who was actually a slave dealer. She escaped from Rockville and went, with the help of the Underground Railroad, actually stayed hidden in the District of Columbia in a person's attic for 2 months before she would actually escape to let the heat off. And she was dressed as a boy. She was about 11 years old, 11 or 13, and actually drove the carriage that took her to freedom up in Philadelphia. And the ladies in Philadelphia thought she looked so cute that they had her portrait done in the uniform. The other one you see here is the attempted escape. Sometimes people were not successful in their escape from enslavement. 6 siblings of the Edmondson family tried to escape with about 70 others on the ship the Pearl in 1848. This is Mary and Emily Edmondson, and their 4 brothers were also on the ship, which was captured. It was a sailing ship, and it was chased by a steamship and was captured near the mouth of the Potomac River before they could get to freedom. And the 77 people aboard were brought back to D.C., and a lot of them were sold down south. The Edmondsons were among those. They went down to New Orleans, but they were very precious cargo. They were worth a lot of money. So when the yellow fever epidemic occurred down in New Orleans, the slave dealers sent them back up to D.C., where the abolitionists had raised enough money to purchase them. So the sisters were saved and were sent up to a boarding school in New York. Mary passed away from pneumonia, but Emily survived and had children and came back into this area to teach school. Now, the mastermind of this was William Chaplin, and William Chaplin was involved in this other escape attempt. You're not expected to read the top part of this, but this is a sign that is actually in Jessup Blair Park, right near the sidewalk of Georgia Avenue. And this is where the incident occurred. William Chaplin was taking 2 slaves, who were the slaves of Southern senators, to freedom in this carriage. He was chased by John Goddard, a slave catcher, who had been watching him, and John Goddard and his men were armed. William Chaplin was not armed, but the 2 slaves in the carriage were. So there was a shootout on Georgia Avenue, and there were 27 bullet holes in that carriage when they finally found it. The one man escaped, as you see him going here. He was wounded in the shoulder and was later captured. So the other enslaved person here was found stunned in the bottom of the carriage because the bullet had hit his pocket watch. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. William Chaplin was beaten. He was taken to jail in D.C. and the bond was set for, I believe, $7,000. So then they said this was right at the border. So then they decided, well, this wasn't enough money. He'd get out too quick. So they took him up to Rockville and said this actually occurred on the Maryland side of the border. And the bond was set as $20,000. And apparently you didn't have double jeopardy in those days because the abolitionists had to raise the whole amount to get him out of jail, which they did eventually. So that is another example of an escape. The winds have changed. Tobacco had depleted the soil in Montgomery County, so you can see here how when they ran out of land, they would plant tobacco in one plot, clear another plot from it, and once they ran out of land, they couldn't grow anything on that land anymore, so they moved west. A number of them went to Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, and some even to Kansas territory. The population of Montgomery County was still not back up by the Civil War to its previous number. The enslaved, skipped one. When there are more slaves than needed and you have a surplus and the value decreases, there are two things that the slave owners could do. They could sell the slave, or they could train them in a craft. And it was much more profitable for both the slave owner and the slave to be trained in a skill and rented out. The enslaved person could then earn money on the side after they had finished their work that was paid for. And many of them earned money enough to actually purchase their freedom. Now, here you see the society is drastically changing in Montgomery County. This little yellow space here. It's surrounded by railroads and the canal. The agriculture had turned from tobacco to wheat and corn, and a lot of things were happening in the society which affected everyone. It was not your old South anymore. There was an increasing influence of capitalism and commerce, making money with money, which is a new thing for the people at that time. Banks, loans with interest, insurance. Local industries cropped up, the Philadelphia factories, the stone quarries along the Sino Canal. But most importantly, the free blacks were being educated and owning property and forming communities and owning businesses. This was punching holes in the old myth of the benevolent patriarchy. People became more and more divided in the county as well as the state. The factions drew inward, bolstering their own views. Several things happened then. You have the politics, 1851 reapportionment, many Whigs and Democrats going over to the Republican Party. In 1842, Lucretia Mott actually came and spoke at Sandy Spring and Brookville on abolition and women's rights. In 1856, John M. Kilgore of Rockville scandalized local Democrats by appearing on the same platform in Georgetown with abolitionists. If the old adage is true, said the Sentinel, a man is known by the company he keeps. We are sorry for the political character of the plowboy of old Montgomery. And then we have Francis Preston Blair shocking people by going over to the Republican Party. Some members of the Montgomery County Agricultural Society voted to strike his name from the rolls as the society's vice president. And there was a general outcry in this that the Agricultural Society was not a political organization and we should not politicize it. Alan Bowie Davis apologized to Francis Preston Blair, saying it was the work of a few fanatics. But fanaticism was becoming the norm as tension increased. The first matches to light the fire was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, where slave catchers could go into free states to capture escaped slaves, higher fines. Before, people could turn a blind eye to escaping slaves. Now they were forced to make a choice. You either supported slavery or you supported abolition. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. The fictional story was more powerful than all of the previous true fugitive slave tales. It strengthened the beliefs of abolitionists and turned many more people toward abolishing slavery. And since the pro-slavery whites who banned the book in the South, and that included Montgomery County. And then we also know that our own Josiah Henson, who was enslaved in Montgomery County, was listed by Harriet Beecher Stowe in the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin as being the main person as a model for the character Uncle Tom. We have here then the four events leading directly to the Civil War: the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where the Kansas-Nebraska territories were to decide by popular vote whether to be slave or free when they became a state. So they became bloody battlegrounds as settlers from both sides poured in and started killing each other. It radicalized many abolitionists, including John Brown, and pro-slavery factions. Then in 1857, you have the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, where an enslaved man who had moved to a free state had stated no rights as a citizen under the Constitution and thus remained enslaved. This decision further divided people. Montgomery Blair of Montgomery County was the defender of Dred Scott, and Dred actually stayed with the Howard family in Sandy Spring during the month-long trial. Chief Justice Roger B. Tunney, who delivered the decision, was from Frederick. Then in October 1859, we had John Brown's raid. Now this was just one day's ride from Rossville. People were terribly frightened of a slave uprising. They tightened the limits on enslaved people and free blacks, and they also formed local militias to defend people if there was a slave uprising. And then finally, with the Lincoln election in November 1860, in Montgomery County, he only received 2% of the vote. But there were 4 people running in this presidential election. So you have John Breckinridge of the Southern Democrats, who was the South's choice and Maryland's choice, but Montgomery County actually went for the Constitutional Union Party candidate, John Bell. The 4th candidate, Stephen Douglas, with the Northern Democrats, never got many votes in this area. So many slave owners saw the election of Lincoln as the beginning of the end of slavery. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Many other southern states were meeting to discuss secession. So what would Maryland do? So I will turn it over now to Eileen.
Thank you, Susan, and good morning. This is the map in 1860. And as you heard from Susan, as soon as the election was over and Lincoln was the president, a month later, things started happening in very rapid rate. First thing that happened is South Carolina seceded. followed very closely by Mississippi. Marylanders were kind of waiting to see what Virginia would do, very closely aligned with Virginia in terms of families and history. And they began to quarrel among themselves. Maryland was the middle ground. It wanted to uphold the Southern rights and to keep the Union together. Most Maryland citizens continued to tolerate slavery even while others passionately worked for a solution. Would it be abolition? Would it be colonization in Africa, or would it be a continuation of the status quo? Montgomery County, on the same terms, was often considered a microcosm of the middle ground, although we usually aligned with slave-owning counties in southern Maryland and the eastern shore, as you can see on the map of Maryland up there. County loyalty was divided also, with about 2/3 of us, of our 18,322 residents, sympathizing with the rebels, and pockets of Unionists in the Quaker Quadrangle, in Rockville, and elsewhere throughout the county. White male voters approached abolition from a variety of directions, some slave owners being in favor, if compensation were part of the package. And the road to emancipation would take numerous twists and turns. So as the sectional war clouds are gathering in 1860, the question is, what side would Maryland take? So Lincoln is elected without much help from around here. He only got 50 votes in all of Montgomery County, and so far I've only found one person who would own up to that in Rockville. The southern states are seceding, and leaders in Montgomery County are beginning to debate what Maryland's role is going to be. And at the courthouse, in the lower slide, is the courthouse in Rockville at that time, and in the same spot where courthouses are today, but this is the only picture we have of the one built in 1840. But at the courthouse every week, often on a Saturday, leaders in Montgomery County would get together and debate the various ways that Maryland could go and how we would tell our delegates how they would go. And two of the leaders in this were Richard Johns Bowie, who is a Rockville attorney, became a state senator, a congressman. He worked for colonization. He was a Whig who turned into a Unionist, a slave owner. He was arguing for the Union side and that Maryland should stay with the Union. On the other side, very often, was William Veers Buick, Sr., who also was an attorney. He had been a state's attorney as well. He's the one who started the Rockville Rifles, just in case we had John Brown coming farther down here. He was arguing that we should look to go with the South. So there was a final vote that was, both of these men are slave owners, by the way. There was a vote taken in the courthouse on January 1st, 1861, and the vote was 133 to 131 to express sympathy for fellow Southerners, but to urge Maryland to make every effort to preserve the Union. So the war begins with firing on Fort Sumter in April. Right after that, Virginia seceded, so Maryland knew what was going on at that point. The president's calling for volunteers, 75,000 of them, to help suppress this insurrection. There's a riot in Baltimore when Union troops are going through. There are some attempts to hold a special session of the Maryland legislature, because only that body could call an election to decide whether Maryland could stay or secede. And the governor, Thomas Holliday Hicks, is attempting to balance both sides, and nobody is liking any of the possibilities, any of the decisions. So into this uncertainty steps President Lincoln, and he uses military and legal maneuvers to hold Maryland in the Union. So from April through June, he starts sending troops around Maryland, Baltimore, Cumberland, Annapolis, Frederick, Havre de Grace, along the C&O Canal and to the Montgomery County seat. There were 10,000 troops. I'd love to see a picture with all those little white tents, never have seen one. But there are 10,000 troops at one time on the fairgrounds property, which is now where Richard Montgomery High School is now. And they were there throughout the war and were sent to various places wherever they were needed. There also is something called a Rockville Expedition in that spring, and they are specifically troops that are assigned to go between Washington and Harper's Ferry to make sure that the Confederates do not cross the river and we can hold Maryland in the Union. And there were a number of skirmishes that went with that. And then in In September of that year, the federal troops and Baltimore police officers are actually arresting pro-Confederate members of the Maryland General Assembly, so they cannot vote for secession. And then the whole time, the editor of the Montgomery County Sentinel, Matthew Fields, is editorializing week after week about how our brothers are at the South. We should go along with them, and that's where Montgomery County belongs. And he was eventually jailed twice during the Civil War for his blasts against the Union. And then lastly, war came very close to home on July 20th at the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, when Marylanders faced Marylanders, and a young printer from the Montgomery County Sentinel was killed wearing a gray uniform at the Battle of Manassas. So here are some of the fine people from Montgomery County who supported both sides. And from left to right, Elijah Veers White from Poolesville, and a lot of people joined his unit with the Confederate Cavalry. James Anderson from Rockville, he joined the 35th as well. Ridgely Brown from Unity Sunshine, upper left, and John Poole Selman from the Barnesville area. All Confederates, all wearing gray, and various adventures throughout the war. On the Union side, if you joined the Union Army, you usually were not assigned to be around your home. It wasn't very popular. So the two folks representing the Union here, one is an enrollment officer, enlisting men in the war. John Higgins is from Rockville, and he would later be captured by Jeb Stuart because Jeb Stuart could. And Dr. Stonestreet, who I know is in the audience today, and he is pulling his weight as an examining physician for the Union Army, starting in the 1862. Poolesville is a center of Montgomery County in the war throughout the war, from the very beginning when federal troops were assigned here until the very end when people were being mustered out of uniform. And both the Union and the Confederate troops were assigned to Poolesville. Strategically, it's right in the middle of the horseshoe of the Potomac. It's near the river where the Confederates are going to cross. The Confederates knew they could go back and forth fairly easily. One came home to have dinner with his mother in Poolesville frequently. But the units that seem to be assigned from the Union side are the New Hampshire and Minnesota soldiers. And on the upper left is a photograph that was taken showing the Minnesota soldiers in 1862, and on the right it's a map that was drawn, and the 1863 date is wrong. He did it wrong, according to Historic Medley, whose research I believe. But he drew it in 1862 when the New Hampshire units were there. And along with the soldiers, particularly the Union soldiers, but not exclusively, you have camp followers, and you have people being started to be described as contraband. The presence of Union soldiers in Montgomery County throughout the war really emboldened local slaves. You could go to, if you were an individual, if you were a family, you might be a runaway and you'd go to a Union camp, and depending on the officer of the camp, you would be received in different ways. There were so many of them that federal troops set up a camp for former slaves who had come in from Virginia near Poolesville, and it became the initiation of the community of Jerusalem and Jonesville near Poolesville. And then Union General Charles Stone, in September of 1861, when he was in Poolesville, he ordered his men to obey the laws of the state in which they were serving. And so in Montgomery County, this resulted in fugitive slaves being returned to their masters. This is under that 1850 fugitive slave law. So, mentioned Montgomery Blair earlier, from an influential Montgomery County family. He's a moderate Republican. He supported colonization early on, but he was invited by Lincoln to join the cabinet as Postmaster General, and he was there throughout the first term. He exerted a lot of strong influence, and he was very helpful. There is a a little bit hard to read, cover of a speech that he presented in Rockville in October of 1863. And he was speaking at an unconditional union meeting in the courthouse about the revolutionary schemes of the ultra-abolitionists and in defense of the policy of the president. And then in July of 1864, when the Confederates tried to capture Washington before Early left, Montgomery Blair's Falkland house in Silver Spring was burned. So, throughout this time, and throughout the war, Lincoln is appealing to the border states, not only Maryland, but Delaware, Kentucky, parts of Tennessee, Missouri, and he is offering compensation for slaves if people are willing to emancipate their slaves. And he actually made a proposal to Congress that the federal government cooperate with any state towards the abolition. But border state conservatives on Maryland's eastern shore, in southern Maryland, and in Rockville said, we're not ready for that. First thing that did happen, though, was the emancipation of slaves in the District of Columbia. And this was done by the Congress. And even though congressmen from Maryland and Delaware said hold off a little bit, the Congress voted in favor of it. The president signed the bill into law on April 16th, and that was the date that slaves were emancipated. Now, if you lived in Montgomery County and you owned slaves who worked, who resided, who were hired out in Washington, there was an incentive to loyal owners only to emancipate their slaves. So the Bell sisters, the three Bell sisters of the Bell Dawson House, decided that they would petition, and that's what you can't read right here, they would petition to free their slaves. And this is a transcription of the slaves who were emancipated. So the transcription details the height, the age, the occupation, the value, and other data about each slave. So there's Cicely Talbot, who's a 70-year-old cook, Henry Tyler, who's a house servant, about 44 years old, and details all 17 of these slaves. And altogether, they received about $9,400 in compensation for their human poverty. And a few years ago, a woman came to the Montgomery County Historical Society and gave 2 spoons that had been given to her ancestor by Margaret Johns Bell, one of the Bell sisters, to this woman's ancestor who had been one of those slaves who was emancipated. So this is from the collection of the Historical Society. You can just make out Margaret Johns Bell's initials right there, and this is Margaret on the right. But the family held on to them even after she was, Lucy Jackson Moore was emancipated, and Margaret received $1,900 for Lucy and her 4 children who were owned by Margaret Bell. So, D.C. emancipation was much celebrated throughout the North and through much of Washington, D.C., but it caused a lot of problems for Montgomery County owners. The newspapers reported that as many as 100 to 200 slaves would leave each week, leave Montgomery and Prince George's County and head for the capital city where they would be free. And they were afraid that the district would become a refuge for runaways. There are notes in the newspaper about federal soldiers being caught taking off with a Negro child in his arms at the farm of Thomas Wilson, who lived near Georgia Avenue. There are 20 or 30 slaves who are about to abscond near the river crossroads, and there's a shootout there, and securing some of the slaves in Rockville Jail. And the Sentinel wrote about that. It's recommended to the citizens in every neighborhood in the county, and more especially in every village, to organize forthwith a police or patrol composed of prudent and discreet persons with a view to arrest and imprison all absconding slaves and all those who are absent from their homes unless upon the business of their owners. All owners of slaves are particularly enjoined to keep them at home and not permit them to go more than 5 miles from home without a permit. So the fugitive slave law is still supreme. So throughout early 1862, President Lincoln, his commanders in the field, and Congress were sending conflicting messages with regard to slavery. Some of the commanders in the field Some of the commanders in the field were attempting to free slaves on their own, but Lincoln always rescinded their actions. And again, he was still working on the congressmen from the border states, and the General Assembly was not ready to do anything. Oops. All right. That's the one I want. Okay. So in July of 1862, did it go back again? All right. Okay. So in July of 1862, Lincoln starts mentioning to his cabinet the idea of emancipation. He wanted to offer compensation to the loyal states, like Maryland, who would voluntarily abolish slavery. And he decided when the Confederates invaded later that summer in 1862 that he would make a statement if the rebels could be repulsed. So after Antietam, when the Confederates did not achieve military success, on September 2nd he issued a preliminary notice that would take effect as of January 1st. And it stated that all persons held as slaves within states still in rebellion are and henceforth shall be free. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave. It left slavery untouched in loyal states such as Maryland, but it did change the course of the Civil War. So it's no longer about reuniting the country, but about bringing freedom to the enslaved, 4 million of them in America. It also sent a powerful message that abolition was imminent. Did not reference colonization, didn't reference compensating local loyal owners as well. So on New Year's Day, Lincoln held his pen momentarily above the paper and said, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." In Maryland, the public officials are generally opposing all of these measures, whether it's emancipation in D.C. or the proclamation. And they're arguing that freedom for blacks in a time of war is going to be worse than slavery. And they rejected Lincoln's offer to pay $300 per slave. So Maryland is generally under martial law. What happens with the Emancipation Proclamation, in addition to freeing slaves in southern states, is that black men were now accepted into the Union Army and Navy. So it opened the door to large-scale enlistment. There was a Bureau of Colored Troops that was created by the War Department. Free blacks volunteered. Slaves volunteered because they saw military service as their route to freedom, either with the consent of their masters or not. And that year, the federal government paid more than $14,000 for enlisted Maryland slaves. Another entry to military service was available through the federal draft, and matching willing substitutes with reluctant residents who got these substitutes was a real operation. The Sentinel had ads for them all the time. So, Maryland, starting in July 1863, Maryland set up 17 recruiting stations and organized multiple regiments of the U.S. colored troops. I found no mention of anyone in Montgomery County. Most Montgomery County black men enlisted in Baltimore, Ellicott's Mills, or in Washington. Some of them traveled out of state to get away from home. One enrolling officer in Montgomery County, he took his list home at night, and he had them burned by his indignant wife. These two documents on either side here are from Fold 3 of the National Archives, which have just become available to researchers. The one on the left is Mortimer King, who's a former slave from Laytonsville, age 36. He enlisted in Company K, 30th Regiment, the U.S. Colored Troops, in March of 1864, promoted to corporal 3 days later. After the war, he and his family went back to Brighton and then lived in Washington and Baltimore. The one on the right is Wilson Lincoln, and he was 29 and free when he was drafted as a substitute into Company G, 28th Regiment, USCT. He was a former slave. He lived near, I'm going to rush. Okay, he lived near Unity and worked as a pump maker for nearby mills. The value of slaves declined as the war went on, And the newspaper in the middle that you probably can't see is a quote from a Pacific commercial advertiser saying that Negroes in, and it mentioned specifically Montgomery County to illustrate the comparative worthlessness of slave property in Maryland. 7 likely full-grown young Negroes brought in all of $126, an average of $18 a head. Before the war, the same Negroes were worth about $1,800 each. So towards the end of the war, knowing that they were going to lose their slaves anyway, they seized on the army as a way to avoid financial loss, and slave owners often got what was called commutation money in return for their slaves joining the war. So this military service certainly worked to enlarge the liberty of free blacks and free the slaves who became soldiers. Even though military life was as inequitable as the rest of life in America was at that time, these black men indeed helped to transform the war for the Union into a war for slavery, to abolish slavery. Okay, more chronology. Maryland's really changing its sentiments during 1863 and definitely through into 1864. The Confederates are not doing so well militarily. Marylanders are tired of being caught in the middle with troops going back and forth from both sides. And politics had changed as well. The congressman who had been longtime conservative was defeated. Maryland counties, to the north and the eastern shore were not at all interested, or were interested in immediate emancipation. The counties in southern Maryland, and that included Montgomery County, and on the eastern shore, clung to what Susan described as an unchanging agricultural society and an economy based on owning most of the state's 87,000 slaves. So the Constitution for 1851 prohibited any law abolishing slavery and the relationship between master and slave as it exists in the state. So a new constitution would have to be drafted to end slavery. And the election of 1864 provided a unionist-controlled legislature. So the first step was to pass a bill calling for a referendum on holding the convention. The Governor Bradford, he's a lawyer from Harford County, and he remained loyal to the Union so long as Maryland slaves were left alone. But he asked the legislature to enact a bill and provided for election to decide whether to have the convention. At the same time, there were delegates who were selected from each county, and each victorious candidate had to swear past and future loyalty to the Union before assuming office. One of our delegates, and I'll mention him on the next page, is George Peter from Rockville, who is a Democrat. Okay, so here's the map of the April 6th, 1864 vote on whether to hold a convention. A lot of people stayed away from the polls, but with assistance from Governor Bradford, federal troops made themselves available to help local election judges determine whether certain citizens were qualified to vote. Judges from Rockville and Medley districts refused to agree to the terms demanded by the military or to hold an election. There were 3 Union Party leaders, Richard Jones Bowie, Francis Blair, and John Allnutt. They withdrew their candidacy because they realized that Montgomery County was not interested in sending them to represent them. So there were 3 others who were elected. At the end of the day, most of the Eastern Shore and the 7 counties of southern Maryland defeated the Constitutional Convention by large margins, but statewide, voters approved holding the convention by 31,000 to 19,000. So the delegates arrived on April 27th. The 3 people from Montgomery County were George Peter from Rockville, Edmund Duval from Sandy Spring, and Thomas Lansdale from Triadelphia. And they were constantly looking for compensation or even to carry a vote. And the convention went over the summer. They adjourned for a while to harvest crops, and again in July when Jubal Early came into Maryland. And at that time, both Governor Bradford's home near Baltimore and Montgomery Blairs in Silver Spring were set on fire. Here's the loyalty oath that was used to determine who could actually vote. And at the convention, George Peter really spoke quite a bit about why you shouldn't have a loyalty oath, but he was overruled. And then for the first time, the ballot was extended to soldiers in the field, and of course no compensation was offered to slaveholders. The Article 24 is really the thing that changed, reversed Maryland's 250-year-old history. That hereafter in the state there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except in punishment of crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, and all persons held in service or labor as slaves are hereby declared free. So on September 6th, the new document passed on a vote of 53 to 26 in the convention. Convention adjourned, it went to the voters. Abraham Lincoln weighed in to say that he would be gratified exceedingly if the good people of the state shall ratify the new Constitution. And Americans were watching the old line state everywhere. The statewide convention was held on the 12th and 13th of October, and special provisions for soldiers to vote a little bit later. Montgomery County overwhelmingly opposed ratification. Only 422 votes in favor and 1,300 votes against. However, soldiers in the field voted 10 to 1 to ratify, and they reversed the majority. The inclusion of the soldier votes changed the final outcome to roughly 30,174 in favor and 29,799 against. So on October 29th, the governor certified the election totals, and the third constitution for the state of Maryland took effect on November 1st, 1864. In Montgomery County, this meant freedom for 5,421 slaves and no payment to more than 760 slave owners. Bear with me. Okay, my time's up, he says. Maryland became the first state below the Mason-Dixon line to free slaves within its boundaries by popular vote. Celebrations in Maryland, 65 guns booming off at Fort McHenry, church bell ringings in Baltimore, white flags are fluttering everywhere, Negroes donning their best clothes. In Philadelphia, this transparency on the right-hand side was put up. It's 3 stories high, and it's backlit, and it shows gallant black soldiers in action, and it was a grand commemoration because many of the fugitives from Montgomery County had gone through Philadelphia for their freedom. And Harper's Weekly is saying, "All hail Maryland. God bless the Maryland citizens at the front and the Maryland citizens at home." Can't find any record of any rejoicing in Montgomery County. A few days later, the presidential election, Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson carried Maryland by a comfortable margin. In Montgomery County, they only received 25% of the vote. 75 went to George McClellan, the Democrat, but it's better than the 2% that Lincoln got in 1860. So, Emancipation certainly left people unprepared. You could see how fast things traveled compared to today, and changed. It's new life not just for the freed slaves, but also for former masters. Once wealthy families found themselves in debt, unable to find someone to do the work that they needed, and so General Lew Wallace placed Maryland Negroes under military protection because he was just afraid of what things were going to happen. The newly freed blacks looked to the federal government for protection from physical attacks, from legal abuse, and reinstatement of pre-war relationships. And this Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which is commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, opened in Maryland in September of 1865. And R.G. Rutherford supervised Montgomery County's program from an office somewhere in Rockville. There are 3 cases that I just want to point out briefly that will give you an idea of what he did. This, on the right-hand side, is a receipt from 2 black men for $1,850 that Rutherford was able to obtain from John Mortimer Kilgore, who left Rockville in 1861 to join the rebel army, taking money they had entrusted to him to secure a church and a school by the colored people. So the victory enabled blacks to take over what is now Jerusalem Methodist Church, here the way it looks today on Wood Lane in Rockville, and the whites went off to build another church nearby. The Bureau also represented Hilary Powell, who was severely caned by A.H. Summers for an impertinent reply. Rutherford obtained a settlement for Mr. Powell, but he could not convince a jury to indict the Rockville doctor. And then when Catherine Bowie, wife of Richard Johns Bowie, had difficulty filling jobs of former slaves at Glenview Farm on the Baltimore Road near Rockville, Glenview, she wrote to Captain Rutherford that she was looking for a middle-aged woman who would desire a good home with liberal wages, a cook, washer, and ironer of good character, coming well recommended. And then lastly, and this is the one that gives me chills always, Congress enlarged the mission of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866 to help finance efforts to educate Negroes. There were public schools for white students, but not for Negro education. So in 1867, 20 Rockville black men signed the petition on the left saying that they would support a school and pay the board and washing of the teacher and to provide fuel and lights for the schoolhouse if the Freedmen's Bureau would enable them to have a school, which happened. The former slave owners for years held out hope for compensation, and after the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which happened at the end of 1865 throughout the United States, and there was a new legislature in session in Annapolis, they rescinded part of the Revolution of 1864, of that convention and that Constitution, and ordered a new Constitution. And with that, they were still thinking about compensation. So they ordered a census of those who were slaves and their owners, who were slaves as of November 1st, 1864. But the census is dated 1867. It also included a list of black property owners, and these are transcriptions of those. The census didn't serve its anticipated function that the federal government would show gratitude for Maryland's loyalty to the Union. But families and researchers are grateful that each slave is listed and their owners as well. So this became the experience of African Americans to insulate themselves against the prejudices of the outside world by forming self-sufficient communities. After the war and through the 1870s, former slaves and free blacks created settlements throughout Montgomery County, helping each other to clear land and build. Some areas had been home to free blacks for decades, and these expanded with the freedoms, and other were new settlements that came up. So on the left is Jerusalem, which originated when federal soldiers started a camp for escaping slaves from Virginia, and eventually worked up to have churches and a school and a community center. And then on the right-hand side is Martinsburg, which has one of those rare combinations of church, school, and benefit society lodge. And Sugarland, near Poolesville, shows you how after the housing was secure, freedom was secure, the freedmen moved quickly to establish churches and cemeteries, open their schools, organize societies to aid with insurance and burials. And before long, there were 40 black communities throughout Montgomery County. So Sugarland is near River Road in Poolesville, and it dates from about 1871, when they bought land for $25 and built the church, and St. Paul Community Church is there right now. And it once was a self-sufficient town of 40 families, which supported a post office, a community hall, and a cornet band. So segregation remained the way of life for most aspects in Montgomery County and Maryland for another 80 years. Today, if you drive around Montgomery County, you can see, particularly if you drive around with an old map, 1865 or 1879, you can see how many of those structures and those communities still survive. Oops, wait a minute. I don't know what happened to the middle things in here. Okay. Well, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Charles Ben Hawley, who is going to describe how Montgomery County recognizes the significance of what the state did 150 years ago.
Well, thank you, Eileen. Are you learning a lot? Are you learning stuff? I tell you, I am fascinated with these programs. I only have missed one that I know of. But if you like history, you'll be here. Well, good morning. I'd like to again welcome everybody to the 9th Annual History Conference. Like I said, I'm just thrilled to be learning more stuff. And if you get the opportunity, visit any one or more of the sites in Maryland. It's really something to see. In the next few minutes, I will share with you how we began the trek to make November 1st Maryland Emancipation Day. I was at Oakley Cabin when I learned about the history of Maryland's emancipation. I was the then president of the Friends of Oakley Cabin for a number of years. It was in that capacity that I would put on my Civil War uniform and read Governor Bradford's proclamation announcing the end of slavery in our state. At Oakley Cabin, we first celebrated Maryland emancipation in 1997, but nowhere else in the state. Others marking Juneteenth instead. Now, if you know anything about Juneteenth, that was the celebration in Texas about the freeing of the slaves. This is Maryland. So, I've been told that other churches and other organizations in this state have been celebrating the holiday. So, in the year 2012, a group of colleagues and I decided that it would be time enough to educate the rest of the state about Maryland's Emancipation Day. And I've taken it on as a personal challenge to educate the rest of Maryland. I mean, Montgomery County started it, but Baltimore is next. We went to Annapolis this past year and educated Annapolis. Now we're going to go to Baltimore and educate Baltimore. I just have a thing about history and about us, blacks, that have done things. We contacted State Senator Karen Montgomery and invited her to our Oakley Cabin celebration of Emancipation Day. At that celebration, she met members of the 54th Mass Regiment and was so impressed with the program that she wanted to do more. We met in Annapolis at the senator's office. I'm losing my voice. I don't know what happened to me. We met in Annapolis at the senator's office where she outlined plans to make this a bill. We had support from the Sons of Union Veterans, of which I'm a member, the Lincoln Cushing Camp, Washington, D.C., the James Harris Camp, the United States Color Troop, Living History Association, and Susan Soderberg, historian. And I didn't mean to put you last. We had to travel once again to Annapolis to testify on behalf of our bill. Those testifying before the committee were Dwayne Whitlock from the Harris Camp, Sons of Union Veterans, myself from the Lincoln Cushing Camp, Tony Cohen from the Underground Railroad, Malcolm Beach from the Living History Association, and Susan Soderberg from the Friends of Oakley Cabin. The testimony was very touching, as I was impressed with the passion displayed by each individual that testified. When we finished testifying, some of the senators came up to me and said, "Mr. Hawley, you taught us some Maryland history today." I said, "I did?" No, but my point is, they learned. They learned because they didn't really know the history of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I was really happy to do that, but I was just thrilled with doing something like this. If you take something and you go through all the steps necessary to make it a bill, when it comes to fruition, you have to swell with pride. I was just overwhelmed because Senator Montgomery took us through all the different steps, and Jolene Ivey. Jolene Ivey was the delegate who cross-filed the bill, and Senator Montgomery took us through to the signing by the governor, and thank all that assisted us. What I'm really happy about was, again, when we got together, and if you have an idea, and this goes for the younger folks in the audience, or anybody in the audience, if you have an idea and you want to change things, be the change that you can affect. And I was really proud of our guys and ladies that went to the testimony, and I'm just thrilled with that. It was a great civics lesson, and I, again, suggest you to visit our lawmakers in Annapolis if you have any idea about creating or changing a law. At this point, I'd like to, this is, if you can see, I didn't have my uniform on. This is the day it was signed. Senate Bill 42 on May 16, 2013. An honorable day for me because I'm from Connecticut. I'm a new guy in Maryland. But now I feel like a full-fledged Maryland. And and before I let go, I want to say or give props to Governor Bradford. Governor Bradford was an interesting governor. A lot of times the planners were giving him the blues. They're giving him the blues because colored soldiers were coming in and talking to the workers and the people working in the fields and stuff. Said, man, come with us, man. You'll be free, you get paid. And they were deserting the planners like left and right. And what happened, everybody complained to Governor Bradford. But Governor Bradford didn't, I mean, he answered them in his own political way, but he was behind the colored soldier. In numerous occasions, he went and testified on behalf of blacks who had been wronged for whatever reason. My hat's off to this man because when he did that, he went against the grain. He went against the grain. Another person that went against the grain. I'm a descendant of the 29th Regiment in Connecticut. Governor Buckingham, who did the same thing. When it was learned that we, the 29th Regiment, wouldn't get full pay, Governor Buckingham went to the legislature and got the money. He said, I want the money, give me the money, and he paid the soldiers. And against the grain. It was something that wasn't a popular thing to do, but I was just really honored and happy to do that. I see I didn't get the yoke. Well, these are just things from our program in Annapolis that we had. Really interesting situation. And as I talked to people, they said, I didn't know. And both blacks and white. It's not a black thing, a white thing. It's Maryland history. And I just need everybody to cling to it. And we're working on that. But with that, I'll say thank you. And hope we can do it again.